And we'll be starting momentarily. So thanks for joining. Welcome to those joining us. We'd love to hear where you are dialing in from. So please put your name and tell us where you're dialing in from in the chat. We'd love to know. We'll get started in just a moment, giving people a chance to log in. I'm Carrie Hutchison. I'm the Director of Marketing and Brand at Rewild, and I'm excited to start a conversation with 3 leading experts in species conservation this morning. We'll give everybody a minute to join. It's our kickoff for Lost Species Month, which officially starts tomorrow. But we'll start a day early, start the celebration. Okay, we have people from Florida, from Cornwall. That's great. Okay. Well, we're a little past the top of the hour, so I'm going to get us started with a video about lost species, and then we will start our conversation from there.
You just hit the side arrow.
This is the moment when a team in Papua New Guinea found a long-lost bird.
Doka. Doka. Doka.
What is this?
It's owl.
That is the joy of finding an animal lost to science for more than 100 years. Welcome to Rewild's search for lost species, which scours the planet for animals, plants, and fungi that scientists feared lost for at least a decade. The search for lost species has found more than a dozen of our most wanted and documented many rare ones along the way, like the Volkscow's chameleon, Fagild's trapdoor spider.
It's more important than holding a treasure. For me, it was more valuable to hold that spider than any other object that I ever held in my life.
Attenborough's long-beaked echidna, the Somali sengi, the big puma fungus.
Fue una alegría inmensa de compartir esta alegría con las personas de la comunidad.
And this little nugget. It's the world's most crucial game of lost and found, given that an estimated 1 million species are at risk of extinction by 2050. Our goal is to reverse that. Finding a species is just the beginning. Each rediscovery leads to media coverage reaching billions, capturing our imaginations, raising awareness,
Get it, Doc. Can't we just save them for fashion?
contributing crucial knowledge, leading to real, tangible conservation on the ground.
Finding the species opens doors for us to pursue habitats protection as well as conservation projects for other species that are also in the same ecosystem.
As our quest continues, you can support us as we search for lost sharks, lost fishes, lost birds, lost amphibians, and more. Because what these rediscoveries teach us is, all is not lost. What is lost can be found. We can protect and restore our planet. Together, let's find something wild for all wild kind.
Man, shit, my legs are shivering. I can't believe it. God.
The joy of rediscovery. That's what we're here to talk about today. And it's so great to see people joining from all over the world: Turkey, Nigeria, Australia, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia. This is great. Welcome, everybody. I'm Carrie Hutchison, Director of Marketing and Brand at Rewild, and I'm excited to introduce you to three leading experts in species conservation this morning. I'm happy to welcome Kira Mileham, who's the Director of Strategic Partnerships at the IUCN Species Survival Commission, Beth Shapiro, the Chief Science Officer at Colossal Biosciences, and my colleague, Barney Long, Senior Director of Conservation Strategies at Rewild. So let's start with just a quick intro. Kira, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your connection to lost species?
Thanks so much, Carrie. As you said, I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships for the IUCN Species Survival Commission, which means I essentially help our 10,000 species scientists from around the world to matchmake and work in partnership with organizations and governments and all kinds of partners around the world who share our vision for preventing extinctions and helping species towards recovery, so that we can share a planet where species not only survive but thrive. And my personal background is in conservation biology, but also in human behavior change. So this kind of work that brings together species conservation from an ecological and biological perspective, but also marries that with a human hunger for exploration and treasure hunting is part of why I'm really passionate about lost species. So really looking forward to the discussion today. Thanks, Carrie.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kira. Beth, welcome.
Thanks for inviting me to be part of this. I am the Chief Science Officer at Colossal Biosciences. It's a company that has the goal to make extinction a thing of the past, probably best known for the idea to bring extinct species back to life. But for me, some of our most foundational work, our most important work is really using the tools that we would need to get there to help stop species that are currently alive but in danger of becoming extinct go down that same path. And my personal background, I was until 6 months ago an academic. I ran a lab called the Paleogenomics Lab at University of California, Santa Cruz. And I have been very interested in using genomic technologies to try to recover trace amounts of DNA from strange substances. And one of the things that I'm personally excited about, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later in the Lost Species program, is the ability to apply some of these new genomic tools to try to find species that are out there, but that we can't see with our eyes. So I'm also super excited to be part of this conversation.
Yeah, very exciting innovations. We have to bring all the tools to the table. So I'm really excited to have you here, Beth. Barney.
Hello, everyone. Lovely to be on this panel today, and thanks for the invitation. As Carrie said, my name is Barney Long, and I'm the Senior Director of Conservation Strategies at Rewild. That means I oversee all of our global thematic programs of work. That includes all of our exploration work, as well as all of our species work. And the Lost Species program that we have is fantastic because it spans those two programs. And it also really hits on the sweet spot of mine, which is the conservation of overlooked species, the species that everyone else in the world has forgotten about but need a little bit of love. And so I'm really excited today to talk about lost species and how this amazing mixture of exploration, science, and communications can really be a catalyst for conservation for those species that are overlooked.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, we like to call them the underfrogs on our comms team. So, Barney, keep talking about lost species for a second, the search for lost species. Tell us about the history of the program. How did it all get started, and how has it grown over the years?
Sure. Well, it actually started prior to Rewild, and now lead for our communications work, Robin Moore, started something called the Search for Lost Frogs at a previous job, and wrote a book about it. And so at Rewild, we started thinking about how we can help save these species that are overlooked and not having anybody working on them. And so the idea to expand that concept of looking for lost frogs into a global call to action to really go after species that have not been seen for over a decade kind of came to fruition. And now it started off in 2017 when we launched as a search for the top 25 lost species. We pulled together species from across the world that told different stories, that represented different taxonomies and different geographies, really to catalyze a movement and a sense of wonder around this type of species. And that was really successful in terms of getting attention to it, and was really almost a communications campaign to get attention. But since then, we've really started to think through this in a much more strategic way. And we now have taxonomic approaches, as you saw in the video, building partnerships around taxonomic bodies of work, such as the search for lost birds or the search for lost fishes. And here we have comprehensive lists of all lost birds, all lost freshwater fishes. And we are systematically trying to find people to go search for those species, hopefully find them and catalyze conservation action for them. We've also just started a new approach, which is national searches. This is focused in Africa, working with our partner, the JRS Foundation, and we've developed national level lists, and we are working with universities in those countries to get students to go look for those lists. And that comes back to another really important part of this program, which is really using this to catalyze young people to get involved in exploration and conservation of species that no one else is focusing on. This can help launch careers, but can also help launch conservation projects by really dedicated young conservationists. So now we're really looking at a comprehensive call to action. This is a global call. We want to crowdsource the entire world. This is not a project that we want Rewild people to go out and look for them. This is a call to action. We want everybody to look at the list, look what's in their backyard, and go look for it.
Yes. I know I love the having the iNaturalist app on my phone. I use it in my yard all the time. I don't know if I have any lost species in my yard, but maybe I do. Kira, tell us a little bit more about the IUCN Species Survival Commission and what it does, and how it's been involved in implementing the search for lost species.
Fantastic. Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, the Species Survival Commission, for anyone that isn't aware of us, we're part of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which is a very big, broad organization with many components. But the Species Survival Commission is a volunteer network of species experts from 186 countries, so almost all corners of the world. And we have over 10,000 species experts now within our network, and they're organized into specialist groups. Those groups really work to convene expertise around species conservation, around their taxa or their country or their area of expertise. And their big role is to assess, plan, and act for species conservation. So the assessment is usually focused on the IUCN Red List of threatened species. So pulling together data, information, up-to-date scientific knowledge to help us understand the extinction risk faced by species around the world, which is obviously really closely related to the lost species search, and they feed into one another. It's a really difficult decision for a lot of species, determining what their extinction risk might be, especially at that far end of the extinction risk of looking at extinction. Determining whether or not to list a species as extinct beyond any doubt is a really challenging decision to make and communication to put out there into the world. And so lost species is an incredibly important initiative for us to work with partners and communities all around the world to make absolutely certain that these species aren't just slipping by unnoticed, but that we know that we're out there looking for them, and that when we are able to find them and rediscover these species, feeding into that planning and action process to make sure that we can take the steps needed with communities, with partners, to reverse those declines of especially these species that so often go unnoticed. And by definition, if they've gone unnoticed for 10 years by science, how can we make sure that we're mobilizing a concerted effort to feed more into that assess, plan, act process? So the SSC has been really excited to partner with Rewild and others in this initiative. We have helped to set that definition around the missing species, lost species, and long lost, and really wanting to focus efforts in on those lost species, so those that haven't been seen for 10 years and that aren't held within human care in zoos or aquariums or botanic gardens around the world, to really focus in efforts to find those species, because it's all in line with our mission of making sure that no species goes extinct on our watch, but where we can, making sure that we can also step in and drive those species to recovery. So the SSE groups are really well placed to help inform the lost species list. So each year we go out to all of our specialist groups and ask for updates, ask for whether or not any species that fall within their remit have gone as lost species and can be added to the list. But obviously, as well, as species are rediscovered, which we'll talk about more, we can then work with those specialist groups to feed information about those species where they have been found, communities that surround them, and the actions that are needed for their conservation. Feed that into the IUCN SSE planning and action processes as well. So yeah, we have been really involved and really look forward to helping, as Barney said, to really mobilize this as a global effort. That's a really kind of collaborative action for these lost species.
Yeah, it really is a global effort, and so are our attendees today, which is great. Great to have people from all over the world. So Beth, Colossal Biosciences is supporting the most wanted lost species, the search for the most wanted lost species. Tell us about why that was important to Colossal and about your involvement.
Sure. Well, there's so many exciting programs at Rewild, and Colossal have been engaging with Rewild and how we can develop and foster these partnerships. But there's just something, maybe it's personally for me, but there's something really exciting about being able to help people, groups of local people, as well as scientists and conservation biologists, come together and look in their backyards, as you've said, for these things that haven't been seen in such a long time. We are specializing in trying to bring genomic technologies to the forefront of conservation, and this includes thinking about how we can use technologies to generate high coverage reference genomes, thinking of how we might be able to use on-site genome sequencing projects, thinking about the application of a field called environmental DNA, where you're looking for DNA directly in sediments and dirt and water, rather than actually looking for the species with your eyes. So there's several different stages where we're hoping to be able to bring these genomic tools to the forefront and really push this together, both in the search for the DNA and then in what do we do after we find these species? Because that's really just the first step, as the opening video said. After we know that they exist, we have to figure out how to help them to persist. And because their persistence will help other species that are in that community, it provides an impetus for renewed interest in conservation of the landscape. And as we know, communities don't exist as individual species, but as clusters of species that are interacting with each other. And knowing that those interactions still exist, even though at minimal numbers, is a really good sign for the future health of that organization. But you have to know what to do. So once we found those species, how do we develop a conservation plan? First step is understand what they are, how they're related to other species. Are they actually unique species, or are they really closely related to other things that we might be able to use to help build those conservation programs? So that means generating a genome sequence. And we can bring these sorts of technologies to help this project, creating high quality reference genomes, doing the types of analyses that tell us what it is about these species about these individuals in these species that we might want to focus on from a conservation perspective. We can use genomic tools, for example, to understand how large these populations actually are and how recently they've been declining, whether there are regions of the genome where there might be mutations that have become fixed in the population that might have negative consequences moving forward, how closely related they are to other species or other populations that we might want to be able to bring into conservation programs. And then also just learning what's there. As we're doing, I don't know if talk about environmental DNA later, but with environmental DNA, you get tiny little fragments of DNA that you recover from your sample. And it's only as useful as the reference database that we have to compare those tiny little fragments to is large, right? That was a complicated statement. Apologies. But so when we're building these reference databases, that's actually helping future work that's going out there to try to figure out what things are. I'll talk about eDNA a little bit later, but it's just I'm really excited about the possibility of using these sorts of tools to try to find these species. So long-winded answer there, but there's so many exciting things about this collaboration that I'm looking forward to.
No, that's great. Thank you. And excited for your partnership. Brings a whole new element into our toolbox for saving species. So Barney, the fun part. Tell us about some of the rediscoveries that have happened so far and how those have been confirmed.
Happy to, yeah, like you say, this is always the fun part. Often when we do searches, we don't find the species and we have to do multiple searches. And maybe at some point we'll actually start realizing that some of these lost species actually are lost. So that's another conversation to be had around this program as well. But thankfully, to date, we've been very fortunate to rediscover lots of these species already. So since the program started in 2017, 13 of those most wanted, the top 25 have been rediscovered. We've rediscovered 6 birds and 2 freshwater fishes. But probably even more exciting to me than that is that species not associated with searches supported by Rewild have identified 250 species that have been rediscovered. And so again, going back to this idea that this is a crowdsourcing campaign to get more and more people interested in looking for the weird and the wonderful and the overlooked. So that to me really, really excites me. Maybe a couple of stories from our side of those that have been rediscovered. One that's very, very close to my heart is the silverback chevrotain, a small ungulate or deer-like species from Vietnam. This is close to my heart because I've spent a lot of time in Vietnam, and it was always one of those things that I wanted to go do, was go look for this species, and I never had the chance to do it. But we supported a young conservationist whilst he was still at university to go do some interview surveys. And he came back from those interview surveys with some very promising leads. And so we supported him again with some camera trapping to go back and look for those. And his name is Anne, and he was extremely fortunate to find those, get those first pictures of the silverback chevrotain. He's continued to work on this species. He's continuing his academic career, but he's now rediscovered 4 new populations. We have anti-poaching work trying to remove snares from a couple of those populations. They recently redid the red list account for the species and created an action plan for the conservation of this species. So it's a really perfect example of how the search can help launch a career, but also how the search can go from take a species from being completely overlooked for 60 years to now having a really active conservation program. And so it's a fantastic example of exactly what we're trying to do with this program. There's some fascinating other stories. We were actually, I think it was the very first one, the Jackson climbing salamander that was rediscovered. This is an arboreal salamander, so lives in the high trees, and obviously very difficult to look for. And we've been supporting searches for it for many years and almost given up. But a ranger on his lunch break actually found the species. And again, a great example of what the species, the program is about, because not only was it a local ranger that found it, because of the efforts to kind of really flag how important this species was, the energy and the excitement of getting local stakeholders engaged is fantastic. But also the fact that this rediscovery led to the park where the species was first known from actually being expanded to include this new area of forest where we thought it was. So probably saving the species from extinction because we're able to protect a vast majority of the habitat remaining for the species. So I could give multiple other examples, but I won't bore everybody. But I think those two examples are just so indicative of what this call is for. Finding new species, launching careers, exciting people on the ground in the place where these species are found to go look for and conserve these species.
I love that story because he wasn't really looking. He was just eating lunch, but there it was. But like you said, the awareness around the local effort made all the difference. Just a quick follow-up question. You alluded to this with the chevrotain about poaching, but what are some of the more common reasons that species become lost?
Oh, there's a whole range of reasons why species become lost, and it's probably the same reasons why species become threatened or endangered in the first place. It's either habitat loss, over-exploitation by humans, pollution, whatever those threatening processes are that are driving species to extinction. I will say there's also another category of lost species, which we've started calling shadow species. And these are species that live in very, very remote places or very difficult to search places. The top of a canopy, the deep ocean, the top of a very remote mountain in the middle of nowhere. These species have not been seen for a long time, but are highly possibly doing okay. It's just that no one has been to look for them. And so we're now starting to really think through which species are probably lost because of threatening processes and which species are probably lost just because they're remote and no one's looked for them. And we obviously don't want to waste lots of conservation dollars going to look for species that are probably doing fine. That doesn't mean to say we shouldn't do check-ins to make sure everything is still fine. We don't necessarily know what's going on in the middle of a rainforest or at the bottom of the ocean, and so they probably do need some check-ins occasionally to make sure everything is okay. But our focus really wants to be on those species that are lost because they're likely to be very close to extinction and need someone to go in and catalyze conservation actions for them.
Yeah. Kira, how can engaging with the search for lost species benefit the specialist groups that you mentioned earlier?
I think in lots of ways. I think there's so many opportunities to raise the profile of the species that specialist groups work with, but specialist groups by nature are volunteer networks. So they have an enormous amount of knowledge, data, expertise, and enthusiasm, and global leadership, but often are really capacity poor. So their ability to get out there in the deep oceans, get out there in the forests and the canopies and look for these species is often limited. And so mobilizing a community to work alongside them or with them to help find these species can not only expand their ability to look for lost species, but also to raise the profile of the species that they're looking for. And in doing so, also raise the profile of other species. I think lost species are a flagship of hope and optimism almost. We can look at it from the angle that they're lost and that seems like a negative, but actually this campaign is all about the hope of finding them and the hope of rediscovery. And I think in species conservation today, too often it's plagued by doom and gloom, and we don't focus in on what can people do and where can we find hope. And I think lost species are the very definition of that hope and can be used as a springboard to raise the profile of not only those lost species, but the species that they represent as well. And I think as well, in addition to what Barney was saying about those shadow species and species that are lost because they're outside of easy access for communities or scientists to be finding. One of the things we work hard on in the Species Survival Commission is combating what we call the biodiversity paradox, where if you look around the world at where the highest conservation spend is, where the most formally trained species conservation scientists sit, where the most organizations are that are actively participating in species conservation, it's almost inversely correlated to where the highest levels of biodiversity are around the world. Most species scientists, most dollars spent in species science is in parts of the world that actually have the fewest number of species. on the whole. And so one of the things we really try to do with the Species Survival Commission is to grow a network that has species experts around the world and really strengthen and come alongside countries where there isn't so much formal training in species conservation or so much access to species conservation resources, and try and bring them into the SSC and help mobilize assessment, planning and action in those parts of the world. I think lost species is a really great opportunity to do that for lots of reasons. One, because we are identifying these species that might need concerted efforts to go out and find them. But in doing so as well, identifying communities or individuals or rangers on their lunch breaks that are out there looking for these species and could join species specialist groups and be part of the global community of the IUCN SSC as well. And so to grow the expertise and the global the global participation in species conservation within specialist groups. So for specialist groups to be part of the Lost Species campaign, I think joining every year and updating that list, recognizing the value in it doesn't have to be your specialist group that's out there that has the capacity to go out there looking for species, but to really plug into what Barney was saying before about mobilizing this as a global community initiative, that we can put species on that list and then call to the world to help us find them, and then to work with those people that are finding it to really make sure that what we're looking at is solutions for the long-term survival of those species. And in doing that also, again, just to re-emphasize, be part of that movement of hope and optimism and solutions, which often can feel really out of reach in the species conservation landscape if you don't connect with those wider movements of optimism.
And you said that the specialist groups are all volunteer networks.
Yeah.
How can people on this call or watching this after the fact find out more if they wanted to see if there was a way for them to be part of that or contribute to it? Where would they go for information?
So I'll post in the chat, or Megan can, but one of us will post in the chat a link to the IUCN SSC's website. There's a directory in there. You can explore all of the 190 specialist groups that we represent. You can reach out to any of those specialist groups. Their contact details are on that page as well. But I can also put my contact details in the chat and people can reach out to me. I mentioned before that I'm essentially eHarmony for specialist groups. I help as the dating service to just try and find people that want to connect and work alongside our specialist groups. So yeah, but the website is probably the easiest way to get a sense of who we are and all of the different kinds of groups, because our groups as well, really relevant to the lost species work. Our groups span fungi, plants, and animals. And so we have many different groups that range from millions of species within some of our fungi specialist groups to the Asian elephant specialist group or the cactus and succulent group. So there's a really fantastic diversity of expertise working across the kingdoms of species.
Yes, and we had our first fungi found rediscovered species in the last year. It's really exciting. And
I'm so excited to see it included in the video as well. I'm all about more attention and priority for fungi. I think it's so important. They're so forgotten. They're the forgotten of the forgotten species too often.
Yes, that's something that we partnered with, is the third F, fungi as its own kingdom. So glad to just keep raising awareness around that, because there's so much we don't know and need to know. So Beth, can you talk a little bit more? I know you spoke a little bit about the role of genetics in these searches, but talk a little bit more about the technologies that Colossal is developing. One of the examples is advances in getting baseline sequences from deteriorated museum species, and how that can support searches for lost species.
Yeah, so as I started to say a little bit earlier, when we're looking for species searching for DNA fragments, so we go out and we collect some water and filter that water for DNA sequences, or we go and we filter DNA out of sediments, or even things like there have been teams who've gone out and sampled ticks and mosquitoes, and from the circulating blood in these insects can actually get DNA sequences from the species that these animals are feeding on. And then you can learn about the species being present in this environment, which is super cool, I think, way of thinking about how we can use these DNA fishing experiments. But our ability to recognize what that DNA sequence is only as good as the data that we have at hand. So we sequence a bunch of DNA, and then we'll take those sequence fragments one at a time and compare them to the massive online database of everything that's ever been sequenced and say, what's the closest match? right? But if the thing that is the closest match isn't there, then we'll miss it. We won't know what we have. And so one of the ways that we're trying to grow that massive online database is by going into museums and using the tools of ancient DNA and historic DNA to get a genome sequence from something that perhaps is extinct, or a population that isn't represented, or something that it's really difficult to be able to get DNA from just because it's extremely rare or it's endangered and we don't want to mess with it in any way that might threaten its survival. So we can go into museums and take plants, or take little toe pads from birds, or take a little piece of hair, even from, rugs or tanned surfaces. We could get tiny little preserved bits of biological material that contain DNA. And these fragments are short. We can't get high quality long DNA sequences. If I were to take a swab from the inside of my mouth, for example, I could sequence a DNA fragment that's many millions or even hundreds of millions of letters long. But what we can recover from toe pads or pieces of hair tend to be on the order of 40 or 50 or maybe 100 letters long. So they're much more fragmentary than DNA sequences we get from living animals. But we can nonetheless use this to piece together reference genomes, or to target specific fragments, the barcodes that people often use to compare DNA that comes out of a water column or a preserved bit of sediment. These barcode fragments are just repeated regions of the genome that we know that we can isolate and use to identify species. And we can use the tools of ancient DNA to create reference genomes from rare or recently extinct or even long extinct species. And that can then help us build up that massive reference database and then learn what it is that that is present in an environment that's feeding into a lake catchment, where we get some water or some dirt from the bottom of the lake. Or if we go out into a habitat and just take some dirt from the surface and extract DNA from that, this reference database that we can build will really help us to know what's present. It's another way of being an explorer, right? We're an explorer, in this case, in the lab. So we go and we collect some dirt, take it into the lab, and then we can say, oh, look, we've identified tens of thousands of different species from this little filtered piece of water. What is it? Let's learn what's there. And there are ways to build up the tools and the reference databases that we need to do that.
That's fascinating stuff. Thank you. Barney, you talked a little bit about how this program has launched conservation careers and brought new people into the conservation community. What are some of the other, or maybe expand on that, but with the most positive impacts of the search for lost species?
Sure. Well, yeah, like you say, I think launching careers is one of the most exciting things that this campaign is doing. By reaching local stakeholders in the countries where these lost species are found and exciting them to go explore their own, I say backyard, but by that I mean their own country. Really to get excited about species in their country that no one else in their country is currently engaged in, that's looking for studying them, whether it's academically or for conservation. And so to me, finding those new species conservationists is the most exciting thing, because there's a lot of species conservationists out there. As Kira said, there's 10,000 people in the IUCN SSC. That's a pretty amazing army of conservationists, but we still need a lot more of them. And if we can excite people to go dedicate some of their time to look for a cycad or a fungus or something that they never previously would have thought about, that's potentially another soldier in our conservation army. And so that to me is a critical part of what this is all about. If that can launch a career in conservation, even better. We need that longer term engagement. We need those national experts, and each species needs a champion. If you look across the world, almost every species that has really solid conservation going on for it is almost invariably led by a single person that's just dedicated their life to it. And so if the search for lost species can find more of those people, it's an absolute win-win for me. I would also say that, kind of taking that one step further, the fact that this program is about catalyzing conservation. Lots of people view it very much as a communications campaign because we get quite a lot of publicity over it, and that's definitely a benefit of this campaign, this program of work. But really, it's about catalyzing conservation, having those people dedicate time to a species, taking that species from being a hidden species to being in the limelight is critical. We cannot conserve a species if we don't know anything about it and if we don't have someone dedicated to it. And so this program is all about fixing that. On the communication side, though, going back to something Kira said earlier about optimism, this really is a program and a set of communications and stories that's really supposed to be building that optimism, and that conservation can be successful. There's loads of stories out there about successful conservation, but what generally breaks through in the media is the doom and gloom. And I think the lost species rediscoveries, although it's only about the rediscoveries, not about the conservation that comes afterwards or the careers that are launched as part of it, getting that optimism out to the general public, to the policymakers, the decision makers, just helps us really be able to raise the profile of species that no one has literally ever heard of before. And suddenly they have their 5 minutes in the spotlight. And that can be enough to really spark policy changes, to spark new funding decision making, et cetera, as well as just bring to life forgotten species in the general public. I remember when the pheasant pigeon rediscovery was launched, there was memes in newspapers and things all over the world about, have you ever heard of a pheasant pigeon? I never thought I needed to know about it, but now it's like the most important thing in my week. It really does get into that general psychology that actually there's some really positive things going on out there. And for that to be happening with something like a pheasant pigeon, rather than a tiger or a rhino or a gorilla, I just think that's incredible. And so putting that optimism out there, inspiring people to hopefully go look for the next lost species, is exactly what this is about, and why we are so positive about this program.
Yes, agree. And serving on the communications and marketing team at Rewild, I can say lost species is the number one thing that people Google and find our website for. So, and among other things, it was covered in the video, but billions of media impressions. It really does capture the public's imagination. And I think you're right. It's counter to the doom and gloom, and it's surprising and it's interesting and it's usually a weird, unheard of in many instances in the general public animal or plant or fungi. So definitely agree with that piece of it. And I will say, Lost Species Month, our second annual Lost Species Month, starts officially tomorrow. So definitely check out Rewild's social channels and website and our newsletter for more stories about what we're looking for and what we found. And I say we, the collective we, because there's a gazillion partners associated with this. And it's a really big global partnership-led effort. So excited to celebrate our second annual Lost Species, starting officially tomorrow, but we're starting this morning. So, Kira, from the perspective of the Species Survival Commission, what do you think success for the Lost Species program would look like?
I think Barney captured so many of the opportunities for success in this campaign that we're really excited about from the SSC's perspective. I think I think so much of nature conservation, nature conservation struggles to get the attention and the resources and the policy shifts that it needs against other priorities that societies have all around the world these days. But even in the nature conservation landscape, species are getting lost more and more alongside these big overarching approaches and issues like climate change and protected areas, which are obviously super important, but we need the solutions to take all of these into account. And often individual species, let alone lost species, really get forgotten in that mix from a resourcing perspective, but also from a policy support, but also mobilizing communities to take action. And so it's so exciting for me to see lost species gaining the momentum that it needs, because Barney mentioned we need an army of people. There are currently 43,000 species listed as at risk, as threatened with extinction on the IUCN Red List, so as one of the threatened categories. There are 43,000 species. But there are 7 billion of us on the planet. I'm sure we can find one champion for each of those 43,000 species and mobilize the recovery for those species through these efforts. I think we talk a lot about reverse the red and reversing the extinction risk that these species face. But as Barney said as well, we can't reverse the extinction risk of these species if we don't even know where they are or if they are still. And so I think this is really the starting point for us to find these species, to make sure that no species slips off the map unnoticed, that we are caring enough to at least know where they are and how they are for us to then be able to mobilize those efforts to recover them. I think it's really at the heart of what Reverse the Red is all about, but has so much potential for us to not only rediscover and conserve these individual species and lost species as a whole, but to gain more of the momentum that species conservation needs so that it is seen as a solution that's integral to nature conservation, but also integral to human health and well-being and our sense of custodianship and our sense of adventure and exploration that we all have inherently within us. I think there's so much opportunity. And so success for me looks like really not only individual species rediscovery, but mobilizing that community to really engage with this effort and to see that species conservation goes beyond the species conservationists, that it sits within the communities that live and work alongside these species, that it is the remit of the governments that are caretakers for the countries around the world in which these species are found, and that we can show the media how to tell positive stories about these forgotten species that are really charismatic and so fantastically interesting in their own right, so that we can, again, generate that sense of hope and movement and success to get others on board with this effort. And from an SSC specialist group perspective, success to me looks like all 190 of our specialist groups participating each year and keeping that list up to date, because I think there is the tendency that forgotten species stay forgotten because we don't know how to address it. So to recognize Lost Species campaign as an opportunity to address that, even without capacity within these volunteer networks. So participating in the process, getting species listed, but also then working to celebrate and to inform the conservation actions once those species are ultimately all rediscovered. And so, yeah, lots of opportunity for success, and I see lots of them already starting to take shape.
Fantastic. What lost species that is not yet declared extinct would be the most exciting to find, and why?
Oh, that is such a hard question. So I think that I'm going to have to cheat a little bit and pick two. One, the dwarf hutia is a little mammal that I like this because as someone who's trained in paleontology and genomics, this is one of the first species to have just been described based on fossils. And, they're such a little charismatic mammal. They only live in Cuba. This particular species does. I also have a soft spot for island endemics, you might notice by my tattoo here. But I guess, and the other species, which is more relevant to my love for the dodo, is Dodunculus. It's the genus name. It's Manumea, or the tooth-billed pigeon. This is one that might still be out there. Hopefully it's still out there. It's a really charismatic pigeon that's in the same group of pigeons as the pheasant pigeon, which is Otidiphaps, and also the dodo and solitaire. So these are all very strange, unusual, charismatic pigeons that I have a soft spot for. So maybe there's a Is that cheating to pick two? Sorry if it
No,
was.
hopefully on next year's webinar, we'll be talking about how we found one.
I
And
hope
there
so.
the New York Times had a really great feature about the dodo and the history of the dodo and why we're all fascinated with it. I think it was last week, or maybe the week before. I can find the link and put it in the chat, but it was really interesting and goes into the history. It had really terrific illustrations and everything too.
Yeah, it was really fascinating. And the dodo, everybody thinks that the dodo became extinct because people ate it, or they say that the dodo was super dumb and that's why it went extinct. But this is an animal that was only ever present on Mauritius, an island. It didn't have any predators, and so it just didn't know that it was supposed to be afraid when people arrived on the island for the first time. And some of the written records say that it didn't taste particularly good, so probably we didn't eat it. But it's suffering from some of the same problems that a lot of island endemic species and a lot of birds in particular are suffering from, some of the challenges that all of these species are facing. And that is that when people arrived on Mauritius, they brought with them things like rats and cats and pigs and dogs and macaques. And all of these species consume the eggs of these birds. And something like the dodo that doesn't fly laid an egg, a single egg, in a nest on the ground. And this was just a really easy meal for all of these invasive species. And that's why these species become extinct. And one of the challenges that we will have moving forward is how do we create habitats for these species, despite the fact that these invasive species are present, where they can still be able to flourish. And this is a challenge that we see. It's a challenge that a lot of endangered species are facing today, but one that, we do need to develop new biotechnologies to try to support.
Yeah. We had a Caribbean showcase at the Jamaican consulate last week during Climate Week, and the Caribbean has one of the highest extinction rates in the world. So I also care about the island endemics. Okay, question for all of you. You can all fight over who goes first. But what advice do you have for individuals who want to get involved in the search for lost species?
I'm happy to jump in first. I think the first bit of advice is to go look at the list. See what everything is. There's over 4,000 species on the list. We are very aware that this list is not comprehensive. So if you are an expert, we would love for you to look at the list and suggest additional species, or if you know that some should not be on that list, let us know, and we are constantly revising that list. The comprehensive list that we have for birds, amphibians, and freshwater fishes are hopefully comprehensive and accurate. But again, if you see anything wrong on those lists, we'd love to hear from you. Getting comprehensive lists is really important. Then thinking about who can go look for these species is also really important. We really do prefer it when it's nationals going to look for species in their own country. That's not always possible, just because of levels of interest, etc. But ideally, it would be nationals looking in their own country. And so if you know any of those, if you are one of those, please get in touch with us. Christina, who is posting in the chat, oversees this search, and she would be happy to hear from anybody that is interested in looking for a lost species or is interested in helping us curate the lists a little bit more accurately than we currently have them.
And you can find the list on the Rewild website. It's rewild.org/lost-species.
And please just remember that, again, as I said before, this is a crowdsourcing exercise. You do not need to come to Rewild or SSC to go look for them. Please let us know if you find something, but there is no need to come to us. We are just encouraging people to look at that list and on their own interest and under their own bodies of work and etc. go look. This is not a top-down search. This is an open invitation to everyone to go get all of these species off this list, because we don't want any species on this list at some point.
But you can come to us if you want. So you don't
Absolutely.
have to come to us. Go out there and look for them. But if you don't know where to start and there's a species on there that you really want to look for, then you can reach out to, for example, an SSC specialist group, and they can hopefully help point you to potentially searches that have been out there, anyone that's looked and found similar species. So any advice, if you want to connect with a community that is looking for those species or that cares about those species, then you can also reach out to the SSE groups. As Barney said, you certainly don't have to go out and look for them. But if there's any way that we can help or that you want to be part of that community, then just let us know.
A great example of that, Kira, is we are hopefully launching the search for lost sharks this month. Probably shouldn't have said that, but anyway. And that list was pulled together by a couple of members of the shark specialist group volunteering their time to really go through and dig deep into that list. So we've got a very comprehensive list of lost sharks. And that's exactly the critical role that SSC groups can play is in pulling that together. And then hopefully we can go after that comprehensive list and make sure maybe in a decade there's no species on that list because we've found them all and people are looking after them.
Love it.
I could say, there's all these really nice free tools out there. You brought up iNaturalist before. There's also a bird sound tool called Merlin that's been developed by the Cornell Institute for Ornithology. It's some really just free, fantastic resources that you can push out to your networks and, get people to engage in a small way first, because then they get hooked and then they're thinking, oh, maybe I should get more engaged. And then they reach out to the SSC. So I think there's lots of ways to push people in the right direction to get them on board with the program.
And it might even be, if you start engaging in platforms like iNaturalist, it might be that the SSC reaches out to you. I was in a forum in the Pacific Islands in Fiji just last week, talking about caring about island endemics. It's a massive, massive issue across the Pacific Islands, looking at how to protect species, but also how to find communities that want to work with us in species conservation, especially those that aren't necessarily trained in formal sciences. So many community elders, school kids, so many people know and work with those species. And we were brainstorming and actively are going to be reaching out to people that are active on iNaturalist to ask them if they want to join the SSC for a regional specialist group across the Pacific Islands. So you never know, we might just reach out and ask you to join a specialist group if you start posting reports in iNaturalist as well.
Right. That's great. Well, we're approaching the end of our webinar. Thank you to all the panelists for kicking off Lost Species Month, which is technically tomorrow, like I said. We will be sharing lots of stories about lost species on our various channels. So definitely look for stories about lost species, other ways to get involved, and always happy to have more people involved in the effort. I know there were some questions in the chat about how to get involved. I think we talked about the specialist groups and where you can find the list. Definitely always looking for funding. I saw a question about that, so please get in touch with any of us on this call about supporting these searches and this effort. We'd be happy to hear from you. I know that there have been corporate partners and philanthropic partners. So the more support, the better, and the wider we can expand the search and hopefully find a lot more lost species. Rediscoveries are the best. So if there are any other questions, we just have a few minutes. I can look and see if anybody's got additional questions. I'll just ask all of you, how are you celebrating Lost Species Month?
I'm going to be celebrating by watching the rest of this webinar series.
That's right. That's a good point. We have 3 additional webinars. So definitely be on the lookout for more information about those. We'll be diving in.
I think I'll be celebrating by looking through the list. I'm super curious to learn more about the species that are prioritized. I know Colossal has agreed to support some of these expeditions and pulling together these local communities, and I'm very excited to see how we can engage more and what species we're going to look for first.
Right.
And I'm going to reach out to some of my Australian colleagues and the university that I work with here and pull out some of the Australian list and see how we can. Australia needs all the help it can get in our species recovery efforts. And I'm going to be trying to see if I can mobilize some of our students here to look for those Australian species that are on the list.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thanks again, everybody. Thank you to all who've joined, and happy Lost Species Month.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.